Thank you very much, Paul. So I'd like to open by saying we've had the opportunity to meet these gentlemen in the last hour or so, or as I say, last hour is about 2 hours ago. And you know, we've got a really good panel here. It's very exciting what we're going to talk about. It's talking about, you know, going from the old world to the new world. And I guess, being someone from the old world, I'm probably quite a good person to moderate this panel. By history, I'm a multi-asset investor. I was a fund manager at HSBC for many years, and I was always on the lookout for something new. And in 2011, I was introduced to Bitcoin, and being stupid, I said, don't be ridiculous. And then came back to it in 2013 at the top. But there you go. We can't all be perfect. But at least I've been there for a long time. Been fascinated by the story. And I think that what we've got here is the potential for a really interesting discussion. I'm going to bring it open to the floor after about 25 minutes. You've all got an opportunity to throw your hat into the ring. So we're going to start off with a quick introduction. I want each of them to introduce themselves as briefly as possible, please. And also to talk about your role within the space and how you think the institutions are getting involved right now.
I guess complete change from the previous conference. I was at CC Forum, and I was actually asked if I was an asset. So was every other panelist. So very nice to have a mature panel and a very mature audience. Alex Batlin, founder of Trustology. We're a custodial wallet provider, or the way I describe it to my children, I'm the keeper of secrets. We're an institutional grade custodial wallet, we're insured, and really there is a point to keep of secrets, because I think what we're seeing is an inversion of value. Most people talk about assets, but the more we move towards blockchain, the more value there is against the key, and really the wallet becomes the web browser for finance. So we'll pick up on that topic as we discuss that, but I'd like you to consider that as a big change to the way we think of custody and the way we think of value transfer.
Thanks, Alex. James Harris.
Thank you, Alex. Hey, everybody. Good evening. It's James Harris here at CryptoCompare, newly at CryptoCompare, so I almost got that wrong. But we are the world's leading provider of digital asset market data. We also do index calculation services. The previous speaker referenced the importance of those, so I was very pleased to hear that. And just a thank you, actually, for Paul. We are supporters of his new edition, the Coinscrum International. He had a lot of OGs in the native digital space, and institutional. Right, okay. What did I say? Anyway, in the institutional version. Thank you. International as well. Anyway, so he brought a lot of OGs into the native side. And now what he's done is he's brought a lot of OGs on the institutional side, and actually we're standing on the shoulder of some really big, tall people here who have built institutional crypto asset solutions. And so I'm very pleased to be part of you guys.
Evening, everyone. Chris Aruliah, work for Bitstamp. We're Europe's largest licensed crypto exchange. Many of you probably know us or work with us. I head up our banking relations, so I joined Bitstamp a year ago to work on building out those partnerships, looking for new partnerships, etc. Obviously a hot topic. Prior to Bitstamp, I was with a company called Token.io. That was formed by a gentleman called Steve Kirsch, who's one of the kind of fathers of the internet, if you like. They got into the crypto space through that, and now I'm at Bitstamp.
Thank you. I'm Dickie, I'm head of EMEA sales at B2C2. We're one of the largest market makers and OTC liquidity providers in the space. We've got offices in London, our head offices here, offices in Japan, and the US as well, offering clients a global coverage.
Thank you for the introduction, gentlemen. Right, so the big story here is that we've had a space that's being created by innovation, by techies, and we've got all the money hanging around with the institutions, and how do the two meet? Is it that the new world of crypto has to take a step back and catch down with the financial institutions, or is it for them to catch up with us? Cameron, we'll start with you.
I mean, it's a great question. I think price action is an obvious point. So bigger institutions, how are they going to enter the space? Is it going to be by actively trading? No, they're probably going to look to custody assets. How do they do that? They take the assets on, they sweat them. You need the price action to make that monetizing for them. And at the moment, I don't think that's fairly reflected. You don't have that opportunity for them to enter the space just yet. Based on that, the rails for them to build out is pretty enormous as well. And that's something that I just don't think, from a risk management perspective, they're ready to get straight into at the moment.
Chris, could you give me some examples in your world? Chris, the Bitstamp, a hugely successful exchange, of institutional involvement.
Yeah, I'll answer that, and also just sort of going back to the original question, I think I'll take the middle of the road answer. I think it's both. So, you know, from the crypto side, you know, we need to adapt, and that's happening. You know, if you look at regulation, it's a hot topic obviously in Europe, and the 5th AML directive. As an exchange, as a custodian, we've got to adhere to that. You know, on the bank side, there's a lot of education that needs to go on in banks in terms of understanding their asset space, etc. If we look at institutional involvement, you know, there have been you know, quite a few institutions that have been in this space for a while. Many of you know that Revolut out there, you know, been offering this to their retail clients for some time. Robinhood, we've got clients like Borussia Stuttgart in Germany with the Bison app, BitLower, etc. So there are institutions that have been here for a couple of years now. If we look at today, there's a spectrum. So if we talk about banks, tier ones still got a long way to go, I would say.
So tier ones, by that you mean
the likes of
the ones we've all heard of.
Yeah, the ones we've all heard of.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, I'm talking about globally, not just here in the UK. But then we've got, you know, some of the tier 2 banks that are, you know, active in space. When we look at our own banking needs, you know, we work with a number of those in North America and in Europe. But then what's really interesting, I think, is if we look at on the fund side, on the trading side of the equation, increased institutional interest, increased sort of building up of digital asset trading desks, etc. So that's a really interesting part of the market.
Yeah, so I've worked on several parts of the infrastructure. So I set up initially a digital asset manager in 2017, which is FCA regulated. We pivoted to custody, so I solved some of the problems that Alex is solving. But ultimately, we were always faced with the same question, like, you know, when institutions, really, to use the meme. And we wanted the institutional participation because, of course, they'd help us scale our business. But the problem was it was anathematic, if you like, to the actual premise of, you know, native assets like Bitcoin. One world might preclude the other. So for us to want to bring the people in who have the scale, we actually have to provide a service that these institutions can use. So when we talk about counterparty risk, well, we need to solve that problem. One of the big problems I helped solve was matching insurance products to custodial solutions. Sorry about that, but you know, it's these were the things, because people wanted to make sure that, okay, they're sending their assets to the bearer instruments to Chris and his company. Obviously, it's a world-class company that's never been hacked, but you know, other exchanges aren't as good. So how do I ensure that my assets are safe somewhere else? How can I tell my board of directors that I've thought about these problems, I've thought about counterparty risk, and we can do this thing? And so with CryptoCompare bringing its data, one of the things that we do is we help illuminate the market, you know, on the digital exchange side. We try and say, here are some good actors, here are some other people perhaps you don't spend as much time looking at if you're an institution and you want to enter the space.
Great. I think it's all too easy to talk about kind of the challenges because this infrastructure is not here or there, whatever it is. I think fundamentally we still, as a society, are not settled on the question whether all this distributed lark is worth it. And honestly, I think we know that centralized systems are much more efficient than decentralized, and we also know that decentralized systems are a lot more resilient. We had the shock factor of 2007 when we felt what resiliency or lack of feels like it. We had a counter-reaction in decentralized systems like Bitcoin, and since then we haven't had a second shock, and therefore people revert to norm and therefore kind of centralized. And if you look at most of the movement right now, we have a thin layer of decentralization, veneer of it, and then the rest is a centralized system. Now we can keep talking about why this isn't working, whatever it is, but in reality, unless people are willing to pay for the resiliency, all of this is not going to matter. We're not going to be here in the room in 2 years' time if people ultimately decide that it's not worth paying for. So I think there's a fundamental question that still has to be worked out whether all of this crap is worth having in the first place. If people are willing to pay for the resiliency, then the rest will fall into place. And yes, you need to have your KYCs and you need your AMLs and all that kind of stuff, which we're providing. But I still think the question is open: is society willing to pay for this? And I think that's why we're not getting institutional money coming in, because we're still not as a society convinced we're willing to pay for it.
I think you make very good points there. Now, on the institutional side of life, I want to talk about who's coming in, in what order, and what, with the sequence in which they're coming in. And there are different kinds of institutions. And certainly, in the fund management side, which I'm from, the touch point with crypto is precisely zero. I mean, well, I say precisely zero. You might get a call from one of the ETF providers in St. Paul's or in Switzerland. But other than that, it's non-existent. So I'd like to talk about your engagement with the institutional space and the types of institutions you're engaging with. Drop names where you can.
Sure. So a lot of our clients are hedge funds. We've got a regulated entity within the business which actually faces other regulated entities that are usually retail brokers, for example. So we still provide liquidity to that area of the market, because we have to remember, we talk about when is institutionalization going to come. This is a cottage industry compared to large areas of finance, and it is still a retail-driven market. So,
could I just reference that Bitcoin's approximately Tesla in valuation today?
Yeah. That gives us context on what we're working with. People talk about how big it needs to be and where it can go from an institutional perspective, but we're small fry compared to what we classify as tier 1 banks. We're not going to be putting tier 2, tier 3. M1 money supply, M2 money supply is not going to suddenly become digitized, anytime soon. We're light years away from that. So our interaction is very much purely on the trading basis. The infrastructure behind it is all internal. We've never had access to all of the internal plumbing that is there for traditional finance. People have to do the cleaning, the cooking themselves. It's all in-house in that regard. So that makes it very difficult for external regulated counterparties that are of size and scale to come and do big, meaningful business in the sector.
So I think so we look at the spectrum of institutions, certainly on the similar to Cameron. So the HFTs, the algo traders, we're probably all familiar with New York and in Europe. Dutch market's a pretty huge market for us. The Swiss market is primarily institutional for us. High net worths, family office money. So we're seeing, that. So we've served that market for a couple of years now. I'd say that the demand from that side of the market is increasing. When we go to events like this and others, we're meeting more and more of those types of folks. The hedge funds definitely are there. Certainly, we're not at the fund level yet. We've got a way to go. Tackling some of the things that we've talked about just now. But yeah, definite increased institutional interest and curiosity as well in terms of wanting to understand how they can trade in this space and what do these assets do for them.
Thank you, Chris. At CryptoCompare, I like to say that we're the canary in the gold mine, insofar as coal mine, gold. When I set up my digital hedge fund and provided an active strategy to institutions, I expected the phone to ring off the hook in 2017. That didn't happen at all. Fast forward here, obviously we've got 2 years of development that has gone through, but now, literally, I'm fluffing my words because I haven't slept for the last fortnight. So, the reason for that is that institutions, the first thing that they do when they want to understand a market is they buy market data. That's the first thing. You look at the market, you try and understand what it is, you try and see what it is you're contemplating putting your money into. And so we're busy, and our competitors are busy. And so adoption is definitely real. We've got governmental clients, we've got corporate clients, and we've got some of the household names here, some of whom that are looking at this from a very stealth perspective.
Great, thanks. I guess kind of from our perspective, we're seeing a lot more traction with crypto-specific hedge funds and active traders, because one of the bets I made as part of the story of Trustology was that cold storage ultimately is not the way forward. It doesn't scale. It's not economic. Custody is ultimately a price game at the end of the day, and the cost per transaction of having a guy walk into a vault is just crazy. It's a non-working business. So scalability, resilience, cost, speed are all key things. So this is what we built in. And what we're now seeing for active traders that need to move collateral quickly between venues, project for instance Bitcoin or Ether onto whatever it is, BitMax, when there's a margin call, you can't wait, you need to move quickly. We're also kind of now extending the services to control keys on exchanges as well to give a full suite of safeguarding kind of capabilities for all assets that are hedge funds. So we're seeing that, but they're still crypto-specific hedge funds. Rather than what we need to do, the next stage is to get the big hedge funds that want to have some exposure to crypto, and that's still not happening right now. And one of the reasons is the market cap is not big enough. I would say the magic number is about $500 billion. At $500 billion, you can now execute algorithmically enough trades without dropping into OTC, which kills the algo trading kind of capabilities. And at that point, you now have enough depth, hopefully, to be able to sustain large enough trades to get yourself enough margin in that space. So I think the market needs to kind of go beyond $500 billion, and then once we see that, you'll see the hedge funds wanting a bit of exposure. I think we're in the right trajectory, but I think this is when you'll see that. Right now it's just too shallow. If you're a hedge fund, you need to move 50, 60 mil, and try doing that right now without resulting to OTC and then slippage. It just doesn't. So that's, I think, the number we need to be aiming for.
I mean, Alex makes a great point because one of the beauties of Bitcoin is you can transfer vast amounts of money around the world at the touch of a button. But as soon as we heard that, the first thing we did was find a way of taking it off the computer and walking down the street and shoving in a vault, just like it was 200 years ago. So there's a sort of irony there that psychologically the world's not quite ready for this. I'd like to pick up on that point of $500 billion. It does sound like a good number. I mean, incidentally, it's an all-time high for Bitcoin. How would the world change, Chris, if we had a $500 billion Bitcoin market cap?
Well, I think, I agree with Alex's point. We're on that trajectory. If you look at the volumes we're doing as an exchange in the top 10 exchanges, we're hitting there. We're not yet at 1% of the equities market.
So specifically, the tier one banks, would they suddenly call you?
I'm not sure whether they'll necessarily call us up, but it will start to get on the radar. And we all know that they don't move that quickly.
They're nice.
We talk to a number of them, and they're all, looking at the market. They've all got blockchain teams. They've all got crypto guys. I was at an event yesterday. I met the head of digital assets for Morgan Stanley. There. So they are attending these types of events, and they're asking questions. But then, when you talk to those guys, there's an education process that has to go on to the senior management level. Yeah, and some of the things that James touched on before in terms of, the risk appetite of these banks. So just the market moves alone, I'm not sure are going to convince the banks overnight. There's still some more work to do. But when we talk about hedge funds and the algo traders, etc., yes, once we see the price action and the movement, they will come in. And then, some of this sort of infrastructure stuff that we're talking about and touching on, we will need to solve. From a Bitstamp perspective, we've done some of those things. So, in terms of we've moved from our homegrown engine to an industry-grade engine from Cinnabar, which is used by a number of exchanges. So, that gives us the capacity to handle. In 2017, our daily trading volumes hit $2 billion a day, and we were 45 people, right? So that gives you a perspective of when we move to the next price move, we need to be ready. So we've got Cinnabar in place. So for the HFTs and the algo traders, it gives them fast execution, pricing, etc. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done across the industry, but definitely we're heading in the right direction.
Can I just, whilst we're hot, I just want to ask the audience one question. Show of hands, no names or name of bank, but any hands up if you work for a tier one bank and you're in the audience. No one's going to beat you up. I think that's two. Well, welcome, and thank you.
Just a very quick point. I think a lot of people misunderstand tier one banks. Post 2007, they've been hugely de-risked. So there's very little prop If you're in very little prop, it means that you're not going to kind of start doing blockchain stuff unless there's buy-side demand. So the whole kind of flow, you have to get kind of buy-side demand for the sell side and the custody side to respond to that. So there's no point in saying when will tier 1 banks do something. That's irrelevant. They'll only do it when there's sufficient demand of the hedge funds. And the hedge funds and the asset managers will only do it once there's enough depth and liquidity. So there's a very simple flow here, which we need to understand.
So it's a client-driven thing. The client, which actually brings me neatly to another question, which Cameron, you can kick off with, because I think it's very much your turf. Don't worry, Jamie.
No, I'm
yeah. So can we talk about the back end of the whole machine? Prime broking, which brings together, the administration, the custody, the audit, the pricing, all of these sort of things. How's that coming along, and where do you see it go?
So if you look at the actors in the space, there's been a huge sort of drain of talent from traditional finance into crypto. So everyone that comes from that space has a predisposition to be regulated. They've got all of the expertise. They operate within, for the most part, under a regulatory framework. They bring all of that area of expertise into crypto. So we're heading in the right direction, but the investment behind that is obviously completely lagging. To build out the back end when it comes to something like that, especially for a single organisation that is, for the most part, running business on its bare bones. There's not lavish spending. You're constantly having to watch your costs within crypto, especially because a lot of the banking infrastructure that is currently offered to you is extremely expensive. They know that it's a captured market, so we're not getting a good deal as an industry from that area. So it makes life very, very difficult to be able to build out that.
Sure, of course.
Thank you. So the key to a prime brokerage business is network effect, and you can get network effect in two ways in digital assets. You can build your business organically, gather assets as a custodian perhaps, and then start building services on top of that. When you hold someone's assets in digital assets, you get the right to do other things with them. Lending, trading, all the high margin stuff that bankers love. So that's one way you can do it, but those are the hard yards. These guys have done the hard yards. Now, if you want to do that, then you need a balance sheet. And balance sheets can be airdropped from the traditional side, and I think that's what we're going to start seeing. I think we'll see traditional banks saying, okay, we're going to take a spin on this, and $100 million is a good place to start.
Right, I think at this point, it's a good opportunity to open up the audience. So would anyone out there like to ask us a question? Sir?
So you mentioned about how the trading, we've been there from like 800 billion, right? So there was no institution comes in.
I think you need to look at who invested into what, and you will see that there were, for instance, some investments that may have been correlated if it was a sustained market. It didn't last long enough. You would need, look, if you're going to be setting up a trading desk, you've got to hire people, you've got to get approval, blah, 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 blah. It's a 9 months kind of game, and then you have to sack them if it goes all wrong. So it's at least a 18 months commitment. You're probably looking at least 5 guys. They're going to be on at least 200. So you're going to be sinking 2-3 mil into a trading desk just off the bat. Unless it's a sustained period, you're not going to be doing that. So you need to, and then there's the publicity kind of issue. So you need to be looking at a 12-month sustained kind of floor before people are going to really start committing that. Plus, it depends on which cycle it is. If it drops off before December, the budget cycle kind of goes, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for another 12 months. So it needs to be sustainable for long enough before the budget cycle.
Can I also just add to that?
Boring, no, but...
Institutions are funny people, right? If they see an asset that's fallen 90% and then goes back to all-time highs, institutions say that, okay, this asset class is here to stay. If you look at all other assets that have actually done that sort of clawback, it's limited. I can only think of Amazon, really. Everything else that goes down 90% actually goes the whole way. So this is bounced back. This is resilient.
I'd like to actually throw a point in there. And I think that Bitcoin's been trading, or trading's probably the wrong word, but been live for about 4,000 days. and I think I'm right in saying that it's made a new all-time high on 5% of those days. So 95% of the days that Bitcoin's been around, most of us are underwater to where we've been at some point in the past. And that's an extraordinary thing, and you can measure a lot of assets like that, and it's quite surprising results. And ironically, the ones that do best are the really, really boring stocks like Nestle, which spend a lot of time at new all-time highs, and guess what? They're really, really popular.
Just on that sort of that market cap topic, the environment won't look especially different. So spread compression has been sort of a big factor in the industry. Over the past 18 months or so, spreads have compressed about 90%. When we get to that stage, spreads will obviously be even tighter. You'll probably get a fairly non-committal white paper from the FCA or other regulators commenting on the fact that it's happened and they're not doing anything about it. You get a few other small e-money payment processors and banks offering us a few more services, but apart from that, not much will change at those levels.
Yes, I think the real appeal is the big money is who wants to allocate to this thing. We don't like to take that. Who doesn't currently? And how we bring this into a mainstream asset class that mom and pop can say, I need some of that to retire safely.
Well, the Swiss have taken a really novel approach. So certainly from a digital banking license perspective, they will hold the hand of people that have just applied for their license. They let them sign up 50 clients, they stop, they do an audit. The audit goes to the regulator signs it off, and then they can continue to expand. That kind of hands-on approach will only make it easier for those kind of institutions to proliferate. But it's amazing to see that, and if you look at the SEC and the FCA, they're not even in the room for the conversation for the most part. They say, do it, but if you get it wrong, we're here and we're ready. So you need that uniform approach, and I think the Swiss are certainly getting it right for now.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Touching on the regulation in jurisdictions like Switzerland and Germany as well, we see that proactive approach, and really they're creating markets that enable the crypto space to thrive, and that's one step that definitely needs to happen. Welcome it in other markets, but definitely not moving as quickly.
Thank you. You mentioned mom and pop investors. I think the thing that mom and pop investors need if they want to expose themselves to native digital assets is an abstraction of the difficulties of investing in digital assets. And so people talk about ETFs, but we don't have an ETF yet. But we've got several really good ETPs, like we're calculation agents for at least 4 of them. And these are institutional providers of products that anyone here in this room can invest with. And so I think that regulation will finally unlock. I think that exchanges are upping their game. All the service providers are massively upping their game, which will make an ETF a reality because it'll be palatable and it'll be acceptable.
Do we have another question from the audience? Gentleman in the maroon top.
I can speak out a bit. So given that we're talking about crypto market infrastructure, you have different participants in the room here. So you have OTC, you have exchange, and you have custodian. We've seen all the kind of profits decline, all the spreads on OTC, on exchanges charging, the competition is increasing, everybody's charging less, and custody it's rough. So where do you guys see value in the market? Because we're all investing our time. It's good to hear from you guys where you guys see the value in the market from an infrastructure perspective.
It's a long bet, so it is. Let's not beat about the bush about it in this one. There's some fundamental signals. So, for instance, one of the big issues for having worked in custody space before is non-repudiation and provability of transactions. So, cryptographically signed transactions is a no-brainer. I think whether or not it will be distributed or centralized ledgers, that's a given. It's a bit like pumping big data when you don't need big data. It'll just be within a few years. Second signaling is, look, we're now working with a lot of funds, and if you actually use the shared ledger properly, you can have your fund admin, you can have your custodian, exchange, all sit in the same distributed ledger, and no more reconciliation between your prime broker, between your fund admin, and so on. So there are many efficiencies around that space. I think we'll continue discovering that. We'll eventually start seeing kind of removal of depository receipts and all that kind of rubbish because you just don't need it when you have a common global settlement layer. ADRs, GDRs just don't make sense anymore. So we'll see that, but it's a long game because essentially this is a paradigm shift in the way we do that. So you're looking at a 10-year horizon. This is an Uber moment. You know, Uber is still subsidizing because they're effectively trying to change the market dynamics away from local cabs, picking up people on the street to mobile phone. It's going to be subsidized by VC money for a long time, and it's still going to be that case for a while to get the infrastructure right. So I think this is a long play.
Chris?
Yeah, I was going to agree with that. I think there's two sides here. There's the market infrastructure side. There's also the market innovation side. So when we look at market infrastructure, you're definitely right. One of the challenges for the existing players in this space is that there's still infrastructure to build out, and we're in sort of declining volumes, declining prices, etc. So that definitely puts pressure on a business on that front. But then the encouraging part, I think, is when we look at market innovation and new products coming onto the market. So if we go beyond Bitcoin, etc., we look at digital assets and some of the innovations on that front, asset-backed tokens, etc. Yes, it's nascent, yes, it's early, but points the way to a very exciting future. Richard made a point in his presentation about when we look at the internet and it took us a long time to stream Netflix over the internet. Right, so there was a long burn of infrastructure build and technology change, etc. So I think the market infrastructure debate and the market innovation debate go hand in hand.
So what you actually said was basically there are three types of people that make money right now. It's the OTC traders, it's the exchanges, and it's the custodians. But ultimately, think about the long game, as Alex said. The long game is that institutions and with time individuals will find that the cost of raising capital will fall, and that will be good for everybody.
We have room for one last question. The most enthusiastic hand up will get the question. I was hoping for a lady or someone over 60. Sir, your question.
Hi. So we know that blockchain is able to do a lot in the finance space, in particular in the transactional space, right? So my question is a bit, I'm going to dare asking it. Do you think basically the blockchain one day will be able to replace completely the need for exchanges? Because in a way, when you transact through the blockchain, right, the clearing is done by the technology. So why is there a need for an exchange? Anyway, so that's my question to you. In the long term, the short term, investor need trust, and it's working that way, right? It's working quite well, to be honest. But this has costs, and there are some challenges to deal with. But in the long term, do you think exchange may disappear?
Can I pass that one to Alex first, because he actually mentions something along those lines earlier.
Look, what do you mean by exchange? Yeah. So if you mean a centralized exchange versus a decentralized exchange, which is still an exchange, it's just a smart contract that's executed on blockchain. Who knows? I think it's actually a function of economics, and that's inversely proportional to the cost of trust or the need for trust. What does that mean? If actually I'm pretty trusting of a central entity and I don't need to pay the premium for not trusting it, and actually it's a lot cheaper to just use a centralized exchange. If on the other hand, you are doing international trading where there's no single entity that everyone trusts, how do you break the Gordian knot and give yourself the level of resiliency that you get from decentralization? And then you'll pay for it. So I think there will be still room for centralized exchanges because not every transaction is high value, not every transaction requires the need to kind of pay for that amount of decentralization. Unless we have a computational breakthrough where actually decentralization is such a marginal extra cost through kind of sharding and localized quorums and so on, which we might get there, or for instance very cheap zero-knowledge proofs. and at that point it might be a moot point. So depending on where the technology goes, if it's almost zero cost additionally for decentralization, then yes, I would argue the transparency you get from decentralized systems improves on that. On the other hand, if we don't get there technically and the margin is still significant enough, cost and time, then I see room for both, because they're just different use cases for different asset classes and value transactions.
But your opinion is more yes or no? Yes.
I think you will see probably hybrid, so I think there will be both. I will not exclude that simply because there's just enough low value transactions where it just doesn't make sense.
I'm really conscious that I'm between you and the bar, so my answer is yes. Come and see me afterwards and let's spoon wine.
I think he's put that extremely well. So I'd just like to thank, I would like to thank the panel, please, and I'd like a cheer for each one.